The question of how to regulate AI is central to discussions that are happening today across the country and indeed around the world. As we know, these conversations are happening right now at Bletchley Park, where they are examining frameworks to contain the risks brought about by future existential risks. But when we began planning for the Fringe, and it's crazy to say this, when we began planning for the Fringe just 2 short months ago, it was our aim to expand the conversation. We wanted to complement the discussions that are happening at the Government Summit about the future, with focusing here at the AI Fringe on the important conversations happening about AI here and now. It's in that spirit that I'd like to invite our next panel to the stage that will give us a window into the conversations between the CMA, Ofcom, the ICO, and the FCA as they consider how to regulate AI in the UK. The panel will be moderated by Jonathan Kewley, the co-head of the Global Tech Group at Clifford Chance. Before the panel kicks off, however, we are delighted to be joined by Kate Jones, the CEO of the UK's Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, who will speak for a few minutes at the start about the organization's approach to AI. Please join me in welcoming Kate, Jonathan, and all of the panelists to the stage.
For inviting me to speak this afternoon about the UK's Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, an initiative launched by 4 of the UK's main digital regulators in 2020. During this AI Fringe, including in the panel just now, there's been much discussion of risks, including bias, discrimination, invasion of personal privacy, and opportunities arising from AI, and the importance of enabling innovators to harness these for the benefit of all in society. Now, it's for government, of course, to establish the landscape for AI governance that will enable innovation while protecting people from harms, and we see government doing that at the moment. But in the meantime, it isn't the case that these harms aren't being addressed at all. One critical feature of the governance landscape is the UK's independent regulators, who are already deeply involved in thinking about AI governance really carefully, both in providing support for innovators and in seeking to protect consumers from harms while they implement their respective statutory remits. The DRCF brings together 4 key regulators who are each taking account of AI, and they're all represented on the stage this afternoon. Ofcom, the communication regulator, which now has responsibility for online safety, the Competition and Markets Authority as Competition and Consumer Protection Regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office as Data Protection Regulator, and the Financial Conduct Authority as Regulator for Financial Services. And before we hear from all of them, just a little bit from me about what we do together as the DRCF. So those 4 regulators recognise that digital markets aren't confined to one sector or one regulator's jurisdiction. They span all aspects of our economic and social lives. They understood that being efficient and joined up is key, and so they created the DRCF as a connective tissue between them. And AI is a really important part of the DRCF's work. For example, across the DRCF regulators, we're working together to understand the implications of the governance principles in the government's UK AI white paper. So that's principles such as fairness, transparency, and accountability for AI. We're also assessing and encouraging responsible development of the algorithmic assurance and auditing market, because each of our members has responsibilities to assess how algorithms are working in their respective domains. And we're collaborating to understand both the implications of industry adoption of generative AI and also the experience that consumers are having and the risks that they might be facing when they use generative AI in different ways. So with all of that, I'm sometimes asked, should there be an AI regulator in the British economy. And what I would say here is that AI isn't a new sector as such. As you'll all know, it's actually a set of technologies that's increasingly being used across sectors which are already regulated. So the risk of having an AI regulator is that it would cut across and potentially duplicate work that existing regulators are doing. Better instead to harness the expertise of the existing regulators, including the 4 who are here today, and to equip them to consider the implications of AI in their existing work and to supervise businesses to ensure that consumers aren't subject to harms, while at the same time fostering coherence and efficiency through initiatives like the DRCF. So with that little introduction to the DRCF and the work of the regulators on AI, I'll hand over to Jonathan so that you can hear from the regulators direct.
Thanks so much, Kate. Please take a seat. Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining today. And we're having this discussion at a very exciting time. So VC investment in AI this year is up 56%, $92 billion invested in AI last year. So in a time of economic instability, we have a bright spot in terms of innovation and AI and the profitability that that can bring. But of course, there are significant risks. And to discuss how we get the balance right between innovation and risk and control, we're lucky enough to have 4 regulators on stage and a convener. So we have Will Hayter today, who's a Senior Director of the Digital Markets Unit at the CMA. We have Jessica Rusu, who's the Chief Data Information and Intelligence Officer at the FCA. We have Stephen Almond, who is the Executive Director, Regulatory Risk at the ICO. Kate, who you've met, and Yi-Chong Tae, who is the Group Director of Strategy and Research at Ofcom. And today we're going to be looking at 2 broad themes. The first is how each of your regulatory powers allow you to respond to the risks and the opportunities, the innovation opportunities of AI. And secondly, we're going to look at the role of Kate's organisation, the DRCF, and how you can all work together as part of that. So going to you first, Jessica, can you tell us about the FCA's powers to regulate AI as it exists currently?
Great, thank you very much. So great to be here, and actually just starting out with the concept of the FCA having a CDIIO. So this role was created over 2 years ago to really bring the regulator forward in terms of our use of data, our use of technology. We've invested tremendously in our digital transformation, our cloud technology. So I've been thinking about AI for some time, and actually I came before from a fintech that was using AI. So I've been thinking about AI for a while, and we've been thinking about it from a policy perspective. And actually what we wanted to do was to remain tech neutral and really just keep our eye on where are the harms and do we have the right regulatory tools in our toolkit to respond at scale and with confidence to what firms need to do to be innovative, but also to manage the risks. And so with that, we have the SMCR, we have the Principles for Business, and we also have a novel piece of regulation which was introduced this summer. It's called the Consumer Duty. And the Consumer Duty is really transformational because it's an outcome-based. It's not a tick-box approach to regulation, and it really puts the consumer and what's best for the consumer at the heart of how firms introduce new technology. So whether that is introducing a new AI algorithm into a consumer-facing use or any internal use, you need to make sure that you have a really robust risk management approach to that. So we're keeping an open mind, and also as we look forward to the rest of this year, we have the critical third parties consultation paper coming out soon. We also have a call for input on big tech. So we're keeping an open mind and making sure we consider in the round all of the regulatory tools.
And you published a statement with the Bank of England, didn't you, on the 26th of October?
Yes.
Could you touch on that as well and the importance of that?
Yeah, so the discussion paper that we did, we took feedback from industry. We do a lot of feedback. We want to hear from firms. How are they using it? Are you using machine learning? Are you using AI? and how have you approached this? And so what we've seen is that the firms are adopting it, they are investing in it, but they're also being cautious about having a risk management approach. And they don't believe that we should set out an overly prescriptive approach to AI because of the evolution.
And just one last question for you, Jessica. We've got a global audience today.
Yeah.
So we're sitting in the UK, but these are global themes.
Absolutely.
How are you working with other regulators outside of the UK?
Yeah, so I get asked about interoperability all the time.
Yeah.
And I do think that we are doing so much international collaboration very closely with our EU counterparts, with our US counterparts. We're thinking about these issues globally. You would have seen some statements that came out this week about principles and principles for AI safety. And so I think we're maintaining that international collaboration domestically with the DRCF, globally with the global GFIN members, IOSCO, and other forums.
Yeah, I flew in from New York this morning, and Biden's executive order is making waves in the US, I can say that.
Indeed.
Stephen, to you next. Can you tell us about the ICO's approach? And this is not new for you, is it?
No, far be it. But actually, fundamentally, as the data protection regulator, you would expect us to have a very deep interest in AI, as AI is built on data. And where that data is personal data, then our remit is engaged, whether that's data that's used for the training or the fine-tuning of models, or whether it's the prompts that are put in to generate outputs. Actually, people have a very strong interest in making sure that their personal information is used in ways that are transparent, fair, proportionate, necessary. And actually, that is something that we are charged with making sure happens. So where people have concerns about, for example, the impacts of AI on their privacy, or the taking of automated decisions without humans in the loop, or biased decisions emerging from AI that treat people with certain personal characteristics unfairly, they can have should expect recourse to us as the data protection regulators to uphold their rights.
And can you tell me a bit more about your plans for enforcement in this area? Because we haven't seen a lot of enforcement yet, have we? But I guess it's coming.
So actually, relatively recently from ourselves, you have seen some sort of early sort of steps to make sure that organisations in the market are really identifying and responding to the risks that emerge when people's personal information is being processed by AI. We issued a warning to the market earlier this year, setting out some of our expectations in terms of the sorts of things that organisations should look out for. And actually, and I should be very clear at this point, that this is a provisional judgment from us. We are awaiting representations from the firm itself, so we've not taken a binding decision. But actually, just last month, we issued a preliminary enforcement notice to Snap in respect of the My AI tool that's has been introduced to Snapchat, and our concerns about how the risks from that tool, which is widely used, for example, by children, how those risks are being assessed and mitigated.
And I guess you're growing your teams to address this risk too, right?
We are. We're hiring.
Free advertising.
Thank you very much. We certainly are. We are always on the hunt for great AI technical and governance minds, people who are really passionate about trying to get people's rights integrated into how AI is being developed and deployed.
And I guess for regulators, that's quite interesting because the panel that we've just seen, we had philosophers, academics. It's not just kind of a typical group of people. It has to be multi-dimensional, a diverse group of minds around the table. And that's a challenge for business, but also I guess a challenge for regulators too. Exactly,
and I think especially for a regulator that is charged with tackling questions, for example, of bias, it's so important for us to have a diverse team with lots of different perspectives who are really thinking around the issues so that we don't fall into the trap of thinking, okay, there's one way of governing AI, there is one way of mitigating all of these risks, but actually we're really thinking around all those problems.
Will, turning to you next at the CMA, can you tell us a bit more about your work in this space?
Sure, thank you. So there's a bill currently going through Parliament called the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill. Sorry for the mouthful. It is making a set of improvements to competition and consumer protection law more broadly. And competition law and consumer protection law apply in AI just as they do on anything else. But particularly important for this context is the piece of the bill that's around digital markets, where there is a new framework being put in place that is intended to help us be more fast-acting and more effective in dealing with some of the extreme accumulations of market power that can happen in digital markets. I won't go into the framework, but there's a test intended to be a very high bar to capture only a small number of firms called strategic market status, and then various requirements that we could put in place to either manage the effects of that market power or try and open up markets more fully to competition and innovation. Now, how that relates to AI, there are a number of respects, and by the way, we're certainly not assuming that power exists in AI or will build inevitably. Any view of market power that we take, or indeed on any piece of our work, will be built very carefully on the evidence. But our recent piece of work we did on foundation models explored some of the more positive scenarios and some of the more negative scenarios that can be driven from foundation models and the various services built on top of them, both from a competition and a consumer protection point of view. And there are a number of possibilities with AI. You can see scope for it to be a very disruptive force, and indeed you've seen speculation in that respect in terms of search, in terms of mobile, where people have been wondering if this could be the technology that enables someone else to come along and dislodge the current leaders from their positions. But it is also, of course, possible that AI could help further entrench existing positions of power. And further, it's possible that existing powerful positions could be used to restrict competition in foundation models, other related technologies, the technologies or the services built on top of them. So it's really important to pay particular close attention to the key inputs to foundation models, and then also the ways that they're deployed. And that's what, again, we did in our recent report.
So the report, which was published on the 18th of September, looks specifically, doesn't it, at cloud infrastructure. So could you tell us a bit more about your concerns there?
So we, in the report, we looked at three layers of the foundation models value chain. First, the development of the models. Second, the deployment of the models. And third, the consumer experience, how it feels to the user. And it's clear at that foundation model development layer that you've got a whole set of really important inputs: data, talent, sometimes capital, and then also very importantly compute, of course. And that need for compute just increases the bigger the models get, the bigger the training data sets get, etc. So we, as the audience heard our chairman yesterday talk through a set of proposed principles that we produced in the report. One of those was access, which means ready access to the key inputs without unduly restrictive terms. And this is something we're keeping a close eye on as the market develops, and are trying to help steer that to towards more positive outcomes. So, for example, we're looking quite closely at the various relationships between cloud compute providers and the AI labs. We also then, as it so happens, have a market investigation into cloud services, which has started several weeks ago, following on from a market study in a demonstration of seamless regulated cooperation done by our fellow regulators, Ofcom. And that's highlighted various possible worries with the way the cloud services market works. Essentially things that can limit the extent of switching between cloud providers, or limit the ability to use multiple cloud providers. It's a new investigation. It's a set of new, freshly appointed independent decision makers. So we're just at the early stages of considering that evidence. But it could, in the fullness of time, potentially result in remedies being put in place in that market.
One last question, because this week's all been about frontier risk, hasn't it? What types of AI are worrying you most? We've all been very measured so far. We haven't really talked about existential risk. and it is your job, I guess, as regulators to be measured, but what's really worrying you?
So in doing that work, and then also more broadly, we try and keep an awareness of those broader issues, especially where they're being considered in other fora just this week. Our focus is very much on competition and consumer protection, so we're keeping an eye on the existential risk questions. We're keeping an eye on data protection, intellectual property, security, bias, etc. All these other situations or issues, and I think it really all depends on the deployment for us in those three layers that I outlined. So much of this is yet to be seen in practice. You can see, again, positive and negative scenarios. For example, there's much speculation about the use of foundational models in various kinds of personal assistant type services. Yeah. Now, these have been thought about for decades, and with this technology, you're starting to see that being possible, and there could be a lot of interest in that. If that power is used on the side of consumers to help people make better choices, great. If they're able to switch between different services, use multiple services, also great. If, however, partly perhaps as a result of the heavy customization that an individual consumer might go through, they're then unable or unlikely or unwilling to switch between services, we might have a bit of a problem. So a lot still depends on exactly how it gets deployed, hence the reason for us in putting forward proposed principles to try and steer the market towards some of those more positive scenarios.
Not Armageddon yet, then? Right. Not yet. Okay. Good. So we're going to go to Ofcom next, and Yi Chong. And we've got the Online Safety Act. It's just come into law, which is big news. Can you tell us about how Ofcom is preparing to use its new powers, particularly in the context of AI?
Absolutely. As you say, Jonathan, the Online Safety Bill received royal assent just last week. But Ofcom's been preparing for the role of online safety regulator for a good couple of years. And indeed, we want to move quickly, so we'll launch a set of consultations next week. In terms of that preparation, and slightly to the conversation you were having with Stephen, I think we've managed to assemble a world-class team. That's been no small endeavour, over 350 roles, where we brought in talent, to your point, from tech platforms, from law enforcement, from civil society and academia, so precisely that kind of diversity that I agree with Stephen we very much need. In addition to that, a big part of preparation is building the evidence base that's going to inform the regulation. So that's included over 100 research studies and formally collecting evidence from industry, civil society, and other experts. So I think we're ready to regulate. Though I'd also acknowledge that implementation of the Online Safety Act is a big and complex task, so we're very mindful of the responsibility. To your question about AI then, I guess, again, picking up on Kate's point, the way we approach these questions is very much about regulation of services and use cases, which then make use of technology rather than regulation of technology per se. And so regulating services which involve the use of AI or machine learning isn't a new thing for us. I can think back to looking at price personalization and the effects on fairness of that, or digital comparison tools. And so we have teams who are closely looking at the development of AI and generative AI in particular, both what are the opportunities as well as the risks as that technology develops in the context of online safety, so that we can understand how the regulation will have to adapt over time to some of that emerging technology. And that's a really important point to me. I think the Online Safety Act takes the right approach of being very much focused on outcomes, protection from some priority harms, by adopting an approach of systems and processes that need to be considered, risk assessments, rather than trying to look at individual bits of content, which I think is, well, impractical amongst other things. But the importance of that approach is that it's flexible, and critically that I think you still give room for innovation to allow tech platforms to continue to develop their products and the benefits that we all receive from that. So under the Online Safety Act, the tech firms will need to take appropriate steps to protect people from things like risks that recommendation systems disseminate illegal or harmful content, such as child sexual abuse material. or indeed that AI is used to generate content which is then shared amongst people, which is either illegal or harmful. And as I mentioned, we will be setting out a number of consultations next week, which will go into some detail about how we're taking that forward.
And it's very interesting you say you've built this very significant team, 300 plus people, and you've built a diverse team. And interesting that some of the businesses who will be listening to this will be building those teams themselves and also thinking about how their board can be more diverse to address some of these issues. What were some of your learnings in kind of building that team that business might also be able to benefit from?
That's a great question. I mean, at the beginning, I really was quite concerned that it would be very, very challenging to recruit some of the talent and skill sets that we would need. And I'm not pretending that it's straightforward. We can't match salary levels in the private sector. But I have been struck that even those who have come from that side, we've had some brilliant talent come from the big tech platforms. And I think the lesson is there's a real passion for the purpose that we have, for this mission of seeing that we want to keep people safe online, that there is something here that needs to improve. And I've been really struck how much of a draw that is.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK last year, only 15% of people studying computer science at A-level was a woman. And so the pipeline is still going to be an issue for many years hence. But it's great to hear that, that you're starting to see a change in the way that you're building teams. Let's move to you, Kate, and the DRCF. We've heard a lot about the important role of bringing these various regulators together. And can you tell us a bit more about your work and how you see that working, particularly in the context of AI?
Yes, absolutely. And just before I do so, just to say, I go into each of the 4 regulators and I'm hugely impressed at the diversity of talent that there is amongst them, and also at how each of the regulators has really upskilled in their understanding of technology and have bringing in people and expertise in technology and AI and data and so on. It's really been quite a significant transformation over the last few years. And I think, thinking as DRCF, what you've heard from each regulator is not that we have a solution to all of the challenges of AI. Clearly, there are challenges that are being worked through, but that each regulator is actually thinking about aspects of them where they fall within their remits really carefully, whether that's how AI is being used in financial services, or whether it's the use of algorithms in social media, or whether it's how people's personal data is being used and so on. There's a lot of careful thought going in. The one point that hasn't come out yet that I would like to just talk about as DRCF is that, as well as thinking about the risks, as Yicheng just said, we're also really interested in facilitating innovators and businesses to continue to develop in their work. And so something that we are going to be launching next year is what we're calling the DRCF AI and Digital Hub, which is essentially an advisory service where innovators and businesses can get advice from more than one regulator at once when they're thinking about an innovation and want to make sure that their innovation is compliant with the law, or to help them tailor what they're doing so that they will comply with regulatory requirements. So it's something that we're working on at the moment with the benefit of government funding, and we're planning to launch it in the first half of next year on a pilot basis. But we hope that that will give innovators a really good opportunity to bring their products to market more quickly, because they'll be able to get advice across the DRCF regulators.
And I like that. I really like that multidisciplinary approach, because again, when we talk to business, one of the challenges about AI is that it brings in so many different skill sets. I know the legal team may not have spoken to the computer science or the engineering team for many years. They've kind of been separate entities, and actually it's the cultural challenge is bringing everyone together to have these big, difficult discussions, and you're doing that. So the hope is that business will also do that culturally as well.
It brings together skill sets, but it also brings together areas. You might be thinking about, I don't know, some financial advice service that you might be wanting to launch, but you might be thinking about, okay, what are the limits as a business that we can use personal data in that service, and then how do we comply with FCA regulations in that service? So you need advice across the two, and so you can think of all sorts of examples like that. So I know that business is thinking about interdisciplinarity, and so are we through the DRCF.
And this hub won't replace sandboxing within the FCA, will it? Or
It'll be complementary.
Okay.
So you would know that we have both the regulatory sandbox as well as the digital sandbox.
Yeah.
The digital sandbox now has a full complement of synthetic data. So the synthetic data allows us to use real banking transaction data, for example. It's got over several hundred different kinds of data sets, over 100 different APIs. And so that broad data set that we have in the digital sandbox will complement our ability to support that cross-regulatory, cross-disciplinary testing that Kate is describing.
And it's really supporting innovation, right? That's the aim.
Yeah.
And sometimes regulators aren't perceived as doing that always, but actually it's a great idea.
The FCA has a lot of experience with sandboxes, and the ICO does as well, and so now we're bringing these together.
Brilliant. So Stephen and Will, moving to you next, could you say a few words about the ICO and the CMA's upcoming joint foundation models work on competition? Again, drawing out this theme of cooperation between regulators.
Yeah, I mean, look, absolutely. One of the things that we work really, really hard to do as DRCF is actually look where there are synergies, but also potentially tensions between some of our regulatory objectives, and make sure that actually, for industry, you are getting really clear direction from us on how we are integrating our positions and how we're making those trade-offs. And foundation models is a really great case in point. There are lots of really interesting, challenging questions to be resolved in terms of how that the development of these models sort of interplays with both regimes. So from our perspective, for example, there is a live debate in the data protection community, for example, about the extent to which it can be lawful to scrape public data from the web in order to generate and train models. But in forming our decision about how far to go in terms of thinking about how we interpret questions around web scraping, we really need to think about, well, actually, what does that do to the market in terms of potentially choking off the supply of data and actually making it much more viable to develop large-scale models if you are already a big tech firm and actually you can access the supply of data you already have internally. How does that change some of those dynamics? We can look at those questions on our own, come out with an answer and do that separately to our partners at the CMA, but I can tell you you're going to get a much better answer if we do it together. And that's the spirit behind this. But Will, over to you.
Just one brief point to add, which is that from the several years now of work on this issue of the connection between data protection and competition, Stephen talked about synergies and tensions. One of the purposes here is to try and correct some of the false narratives that can arise in these kinds of situations. A really obvious one here is that sometimes people, sometimes for sort of self-serving reasons, choose to pit competition and data protection against one another, assuming that if you get more of one, you lose some of the other. In practice, and as we've looked at it, there are quite often ways of actually maximising the synergies, and for example, minimising the risk of companies doing things for notionally privacy-enhancing reasons that actually cause undue problems for competition.
Thanks, Will. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I would like to get some questions from the room. If there are any, we have to keep them super brief. But if you have a question, please put your hand up. And I think we have a lady here. There's a mic coming down to you. Or keep your hand up. So, no, thank you very much. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Sue Milton. 2 questions. One is, why is the FRC not part of this panel? Are they part of the forum? Second question is something I've not really heard today in any of the conversations. It's the ability of redress. So each of us individually or collectively can go, hey, we think this is wrong. How can we build that in? Because to me, that is one of the otherwise potential harms we need to avoid up front.
Great question. Kate, would you like to take that?
Yes, on that second question. I think, I mentioned at the start that it's for the government overall to think about the whole landscape of AI governance. And in the government's white paper, one of the principles that they mentioned is the principle of accountability. The regulators are thinking about supervision and enforcement against businesses where they don't comply with the rules that are in place. But it will be for government to think about that accountability piece for individuals if they find that existing laws aren't sufficient for that.
And I could probably add a bit of context, for example, in our own area. So in relation to how your personal information is processed, you have rights. They're set out in the legislation very clearly in terms of rights to access your personal data that's held, rights in terms of the accuracy of your information, and as well as principles in terms of how your information should be processed. And really, you've got, I suppose, two routes to getting redress. One, of course, is by exercising your rights directly with the firms that are processing your personal data and actually saying, look, actually, I don't want my personal data to be processed. Please delete it, for example. The other, of course, is that you can make a complaint to us as the Information Commissioner's Office, where you feel like your data is being processed in ways that are not in compliance with our data protection principles around fairness, transparency, for example. And we will take forward, and we have the ability to investigate your complaints and take forward action on your behalf. But actually, that is just one of the regulatory regimes in this space. And depending on the nature of the harms and the sorts of issues that come up, there'll be other avenues. There are plenty of avenues, for example, in relation to financial services, if you have concerns. So really, it's about having a really rich framework of rights and powers that fit the context that you are looking at the use of AI.
Thank you so much. That brings this session to a close. It's been such a privilege to have so many skills and perspective on the stage today. Great power, but also great responsibility sits with these individuals on the stage. The force is with you. And I'd like us to thank the panel in the usual way. And thanks again.